Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile law office, surrounded by family members who've spent decades treating you like an afterthought, watching them divide up millions while you get handed $25 in a room full of Snickers. That was my Tuesday afternoon. But what happened next? Well, let's just say my grandmother Rose had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, and her final move changed absolutely everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Chen, and I've spent most of my adult life being the family disappointment. While my cousins Madison and Tyler climbed corporate ladders and collected designer everything, I chose a different path entirely. After college, I became a social worker in Boulder, helping kids navigate the foster system. The pay was terrible, my apartment was tiny, and every family gathering became an interrogation about when I'd finally get serious about life. The Chen family had built their fortune through 3 generations of import business success. My great-grandparents arrived from Taiwan with nothing but determination and a suitcase. They scratched and saved until they could open a small import shop. My grandfather expanded it, and by the time my father and his siblings took over, Chen Import had become a powerhouse, moving everything from electronics to artisan goods across the Pacific. But here's the thing about family businesses: they demand loyalty above all else. When you choose compassion over commerce, when you pick purpose over profit margins, you become the black sheep pretty quickly. At every holiday dinner, every birthday celebration, every summer barbecue, I was the one who didn't quite fit, the one with the noble but naive career, the one who couldn't be counted on for serious family decisions. My grandmother Rose, though, she was different. While my aunts and uncles would make subtle comments about my choices, Grandma Rose would pull me aside and ask about my work. Really ask. She wanted to know about the teenagers I was helping, the families I was trying to keep together, the small victories that meant everything to me but nothing to anyone else in our family. She had this way of listening that made you feel like your words actually mattered. Her eyes would focus completely on you, and she'd nod at just the right moments, ask follow-up questions that showed she was really processing what you were saying. In a family where conversations often felt like competitions or business meetings, those moments with Grandma Rose were sacred. I remember one Christmas Eve when I was about 26, feeling particularly defeated after another round of well-meaning but cutting remarks from Aunt Patricia about my phase. Grandma Rose found me on her back porch, staring at the snow-covered mountains that surrounded her Denver home. "You know what I see when I look at you, Emma," she said, settling into the wooden chair beside me despite the cold. I shook my head, honestly curious but also bracing for more disappointment. "I see someone who chose the harder path because it was the right path. That takes a kind of courage your cousins don't even know exists yet." Those words stayed with me through every difficult case, every small paycheck, every moment when I wondered if I'd made the wrong choice. But as years passed, I noticed Grandma Rose getting quieter at family gatherings. She'd still light up when talking to me, but something was shifting. The family business was evolving, growing more complex, and the younger generation was taking over operations. Madison had proven herself brilliant with international negotiations. Tyler had revolutionized their digital presence and logistics systems. Even Sophie, barely out of college, was already showing promise in market analysis. They were the golden children, the ones who understood spreadsheets and profit margins, the ones who could speak the language of success that our family valued most. And then there was me, still driving my beat-up Honda Civic to home visits, still fighting the system for kids who had no one else fighting for them. At family gatherings, conversations would swirl around expansion plans and market opportunities, while I sat quietly, occasionally asked polite questions about my little projects, but never really included in anything substantial. The truth was, I had started to accept my role as the family afterthought. It hurt, but it also freed me in a strange way. I didn't have to perform or pretend to be someone I wasn't. I could focus on my work, on making a real difference in individual lives, even if that difference couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. But Grandma Rose, even as she grew frailer, never stopped asking about my work. She wanted details about the kids I was helping, updates on families I'd mentioned months earlier. She remembered names and stories in a way that amazed me. Sometimes I wondered if she was the only one in our entire extended family who truly saw me as a person rather than a disappointment. When she died last spring at 87, it felt like losing the one person who had really understood me. The funeral was massive, hundreds of people whose lives she had touched, business associates who respected her wisdom, community members who had benefited from her quiet generosity. But in all those stories people shared, I kept hearing about acts of kindness and support that none of us in the family had known about. People mentioned scholarships that had appeared when they needed them most, anonymous donations that had saved local programs, mysterious benefactors who had helped them through impossible situations. It painted a picture of Grandma Rose as someone who had been secretly active in ways that went far beyond our family's business empire. The weeks after the funeral blurred together. There were arrangements to make, belongings to sort through, and endless family discussions about the future of Chen Import. I helped where I could, but mostly I stayed in the background, processing my grief and trying to figure out how to move forward without the one person who had always believed in my choices. So when Mr. Peterson called to schedule the formal reading of Grandma Rose's will, I almost didn't go. Family legal meetings weren't really my territory, and I assumed it would be mostly about business transfers and property divisions that didn't concern me. But something in his voice, a careful formality that seemed to carry extra weight, made me change my mind. The law office in downtown Denver was everything you'd expect from a firm that handled wealthy families. Mahogany panels, leather-bound books, oil paintings of stern-looking men in expensive suits. When I walked into the conference room, I immediately felt underdressed in my thrift store blazer and Target heels, but that was nothing new. Madison was already there, perfectly put together as always in a designer suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Tyler sat beside her, scrolling through his phone with the confident air of someone who belonged in places like this. Aunt Patricia held court at one end of the table, discussing estate tax implications with Uncle Robert like they were planning their next business acquisition. Even Sophie looked more polished than me, fresh from her MBA program, and clearly comfortable in this world of legal documents and financial planning. They all belonged here in a way I never would, speaking the language of inheritances and asset management like native speakers, while I felt like a tourist trying to navigate with a phrasebook. Mr. Peterson entered with a thick folder, and the kind of measured composure that suggested he'd done this many times before. He took his place at the head of the table, adjusted his glasses, and began with the standard legal language about
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Grandma Rose's final wishes and the distribution of her estate. The bulk of it was predictable. Madison received Grandma Rose's Denver house and a substantial cash inheritance. Tyler got controlling interest in the family business along with investment accounts that would set him up for life. Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia received generous amounts that would secure comfortable retirements. Even Sophie, as the youngest, was set up with trust funds and education accounts that would carry her through graduate school and beyond. Each announcement was met with nods of satisfaction, quiet expressions of gratitude, and the kind of relief that comes when expectations are met. This was how things were supposed to work in families like ours. The people who had contributed to building the legacy received their share of that legacy. And then Mr. Peterson reached the bottom of his list. He looked up from his documents, and for just a moment his professional composure seemed to falter slightly. And to Emma Chen, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "Your grandmother leaves the sum of $25, along with her appreciation for your dedicated service to others." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Madison let out a short laugh. Tyler didn't even look up from his phone, just shook his head with what looked like second-hand embarrassment. Aunt Patricia's reaction was the worst, a sympathetic smile that somehow managed to be more cutting than outright mockery. "Well," she said in that tone she used when she was being charitable, "that's very Rose. Always thinking of everyone even." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire you couldn't quite locate. Uncle Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Emma, you know your grandmother loved you very much. This isn't about the amount, it's about the gesture." But it wasn't about love, and we all knew it. $25 was what you might leave a distant acquaintance, a casual friend, someone you wanted to remember but not really support. It was a polite acknowledgement, nothing more. After 31 years of being Rose Chen's granddaughter, after all those conversations on her back porch, after feeling like she was the one person who truly saw me, I had been valued at less than the cost of a nice dinner. The shame burned in my chest like acid. Not because I needed money, I had never expected wealth, but because of what the amount said about my place in her heart. All those times I thought we were connecting, all those moments when I felt understood and valued, had apparently meant something very different to her than they had to me. I sat frozen while the family discussed next steps and timeline details, my face burning with embarrassment that felt visible from space. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the confirmation of something I had always feared. That despite Grandma Rose's kindness, despite her questions and attention, I had never really mattered to her the way Madison and Tyler did. I was the charity case, the one who got polite acknowledgement while the real grandchildren got real inheritance. When Mr. Peterson finally closed his folder and began shuffling papers, I stood up quickly, mumbling something about needing to get back to work. I needed to escape before anyone could offer more sympathetic explanations or uncomfortable reassurances about Grandma Rose's intentions. But just as I reached for my purse and prepared to make the walk of shame to the door, Mr. Peterson spoke again. "Miss Chen," he said quietly, "could you please remain for a moment? There's one additional matter your grandmother asked me to handle privately." The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Instead of awkward amusement, there was curiosity, maybe even concern. Madison actually looked up from her phone. Tyler stopped gathering his papers. "Additional matter?" Aunt Patricia asked, her voice sharp with sudden attention. Mr. Peterson's expression remained carefully neutral. "Yes, something Mrs. Chen specifically requested be handled separately, after the formal reading." I looked around the room at my family's faces, seeing questions and uncertainty, where moments before there had been comfortable superiority. Whatever this was, they didn't know about it either. And for the first time since I'd walked into that office, I wasn't the only one who felt unprepared. The tension in that conference room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Madison shifted in her chair, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table. Tyler had finally put down his phone, his attention fully focused on Mr. Peterson for the first time since we'd walked into the room. Even Sophie, who had been quietly reviewing her own inheritance documents, looked up with genuine curiosity. Aunt Patricia's voice carried the sharp edge it always took on when she sensed information being withheld. "Mr. Peterson, I think we'd all appreciate understanding what this additional matter involves. We are Rose's closest family, after all." Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and maintained his professional composure, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of what might have been anticipation, or perhaps concern. "I understand your curiosity, Mrs. Williams, but Mrs. Chen was very specific about this being a private matter between myself and Emma. The rest of you are welcome to wait if you'd like, but this conversation needs to happen without an audience." Uncle Robert stood up, smoothing his tie with the kind of measured movement that suggested he was fighting to maintain control. "This is highly irregular, Peterson. Rose never mentioned any separate arrangements to any of us. What could she possibly have needed to discuss with Emma that couldn't be handled in front of the family?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the familiar burn of being discussed as if I weren't sitting right there. But something in Mr. Peterson's demeanor had changed. The careful deference he had shown to my aunt and uncle during the formal reading was gone, replaced by a quiet authority that suggested he was no longer taking requests. "I'm afraid Mrs. Chen's instructions were quite clear," he said simply. "And as her attorney, I'm bound to follow them precisely." Madison gathered her purse with sharp, efficient movements that broadcasted her displeasure. "Fine, but Emma, call me later. I want to know what this is about." It wasn't a request. Tyler was already heading toward the door, clearly annoyed at having his time wasted on what he probably assumed was some minor clerical issue. "This better not complicate the business transfers, Peterson. We have timelines to meet." Sophie hesitated near her chair, looking between me and the departing family members with obvious confusion. "Emma, are you okay? Do you want me to stay?" For a moment I almost said yes. Sophie had always been the kindest of my cousins, the one least likely to participate in the subtle dismissals that characterized most family interactions. But something in Mr. Peterson's expression suggested that whatever was coming needed to happen without witnesses, even sympathetic ones. "I'll be fine," I told her, managing what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "Probably just some paperwork thing about Grandma's charity donations or something." After they left, the conference room felt completely different. The mahogany walls that had seemed imposing and formal now felt protective, like a sanctuary where different rules might apply. Mr. Peterson waited until the sound of footsteps and muffled conversations had faded from the hallway before he spoke again. "Emma," he said, and his voice had lost its courtroom formality, becoming almost gentle, "your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. I've been the Chen family attorney for nearly 20 years, and I can tell you with certainty that Rose was the most thoughtful client I've ever had the privilege to serve." I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. The shame from the $25 inheritance was still burning in my chest, making it hard to imagine what thoughtfulness could possibly be coming next. Mr. Peterson opened a different folder, this one noticeably thicker than the documents he had been reading from earlier. "What happened in there?" "With the formal will reading, that was theater. Rose knew exactly how your family would react, and she needed them to see it. She needed you to see it too." My breath caught. "Theater? Emma, your grandmother spent the last 3 years of her life planning something remarkable. She wanted to understand with absolute clarity who her family really was when they thought no one important was watching. The will we just read, the one that left you $25, that was the test." He pulled out a sealed envelope, much larger and heavier than anything that had been distributed during the formal reading. My name was written across the front in Grandma Rose's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script that had addressed birthday cards and thank you notes throughout my childhood. "This is your grandmother's real will, Emma, the one that matters." My hands were shaking as I reached for the envelope. The paper was expensive, creamy and thick, with a weight that suggested importance. The seal was deep red wax, pressed with what looked like a traditional Chinese character I didn't recognize. "She wrote this herself," Mr. Peterson continued, "over the course of several months. She wanted to make sure every word was exactly right. She also asked me to be here when you read it, to answer any questions and to help with the practical aspects of what she's left you." I broke the seal carefully, as if the envelope might contain something fragile. The letter inside was written on matching paper, several pages thick, filled with Grandma Rose's neat handwriting. Just seeing her words again made my throat tight with grief and something else, a flutter of possibility that I was afraid to acknowledge. The first line stopped me cold. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then you've just experienced what I hope will be the last time anyone in our family underestimates you." I looked up at Mr. Peterson, who was watching me with patient kindness. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew exactly how they would react. She knew because she'd been watching it happen for years," he replied. "Rose told me that watching your family treat you like an afterthought was one of the most painful experiences of her later life. But she also said it showed her exactly who you were when faced with dismissal and disappointment. You never became bitter, Emma. You never stopped doing good work just because it wasn't appreciated. I continued reading, my heart pounding harder with each line. You are the only one of my grandchildren who chose purpose over profit, service over status. While Madison and Tyler learned to navigate boardrooms, you learned to navigate broken systems and help the people everyone else had given up on. While they collected achievements, you collected moments of human connection that changed lives. The letter continued, and with each paragraph, I felt like I was discovering a version of my grandmother I had never fully known. She wrote about watching me work with difficult teenagers, about hearing stories of families I had helped keep together, about the quiet ways I had made myself indispensable to a community that most people overlooked. But more than your work, Emma, I watched your character. I watched you absorb dismissal and criticism without becoming cruel yourself. I watched you face financial struggles without compromising your values. I watched you choose empathy over resentment, again and again, even when resentment would have been easier. My vision was blurring with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. There was something building in her words, a momentum that suggested revelations still to come, which brings me to why I constructed this elaborate charade. I needed your cousins and your aunt and uncle to show you exactly who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. I needed you to see their laughter, their dismissal, their casual cruelty, because what comes next will change everything, and you needed to understand the difference between people who love you for who you are, and people who will love you for what you have. I looked up at Mr. Peterson again. What comes next? He smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him all day. Keep reading, Emma. Your grandmother. It was just getting started. The next section of the letter was written in different ink, as if she had taken a break and returned to it later. The handwriting was slightly shakier, but the words were clear and decisive. Emma, the $25 you received today represents something important. It's the exact amount I was given by my own grandmother when I was about your age, when my family thought I was making foolish choices by marrying your grandfather and moving to America. That $25 was supposed to be a message that my dreams were worthless. Instead, it became the seed money for everything our family has built. I had never heard this story before. In all our conversations, Grandma Rose had never mentioned receiving her own dismissive inheritance, never shared the parallel between her experience and mine. I kept that $25 for 60 years, Emma. It's been in my jewelry box, uncashed, a reminder that other people's opinions of yours have nothing to do with your actual value. Today, you received your own $25 from a family that thinks they understand your worth. I hope you'll keep it as I kept mine, as a reminder of this moment when everything changed. The letter continued, but the next section made me sit back in my chair, dizzy with disbelief. But Emma, unlike my grandmother, I am not giving you just symbolic hope. I am giving you the resources to make the changes you've dreamed of making, but on a scale you've never imagined possible. The formal will that was read today distributed a fraction of my actual estate. The bulk of my assets, my real legacy, belongs to you. Mr. Peterson was watching my face carefully. Emma, are you all right? Do you need some water? I shook my head, afraid that speaking would somehow make the words on the page disappear. I forced myself to continue reading. You are now the sole owner of the Rose Chen Foundation, which I have been building quietly for the past 15 years. The foundation has assets worth approximately $12 million, all dedicated to supporting the kind of work you've been doing your entire career: foster care advocacy, family preservation services, educational support for at-risk youth, housing assistance for families in crisis. Everything you've been fighting for on a case-by-case basis can now be fought for systematically. $12 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like reading about someone else's life in a newspaper. I had never even seen $12,000 in one place, let alone 12 million. But that's not all, my dear granddaughter. You are also now the majority shareholder of Chen Import and Export, with controlling interest in the company your great-grandparents built. Madison and Tyler received management positions and generous salaries, but you own the company they'll be working for. I actually laughed out loud, a sharp sound that echoed strangely in the quiet conference room. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. 20 minutes ago, I had been the family disappointment walking away with $25. Now I was apparently the majority owner of a multi-million-dollar business that I knew absolutely nothing about running. I can see you're probably panicking about the business ownership, the letter continued, as if Grandma Rose had anticipated my exact reaction. Don't worry, you don't need to learn import regulations or manage shipping logistics. You need to do what you've always done, see the bigger picture and make decisions based on your values. The day-to-day operations will continue to be handled by people who understand those details. But the major decisions, the direction of the company, the way it treats employees, the communities it impacts, those decisions will be guided by your conscience. Mr. Peterson leaned forward slightly. Emma, there's more. The foundation and the business holdings are substantial, but there are other assets as well. Your grandmother owned properties you didn't know about, investments that have been growing for decades, accounts that were kept separate from everything the family knew about. I was having trouble processing the information. It felt like trying to hold water in my hands. The harder I gripped, the more it slipped away. How is this possible? How did no one in the family know about any of this? Your grandmother was extraordinarily careful about privacy, Mr. Peterson explained. The foundation was established through a separate legal entity. The additional business investments were made through holding companies. Even I didn't understand the full scope of what she had been building until she brought me all the documentation 6 months before she died. I returned to the letter, my hands still shaking slightly. Emma, I know this feels overwhelming, and I know you're probably wondering why I chose you for this responsibility. The answer is simple. You're the only one who has ever made decisions based on what was right, rather than what was profitable. You're the only one who has proven that you can hold power without being corrupted by it, because you've been doing important work without any power at all. The next paragraph made my breath catch. You see, my dear, I haven't just been watching your family dynamics, I've been watching your work. For the past 8 years, I have been the anonymous donor who has funded the emergency assistance program at your agency. Every time you needed money to help a family facing eviction, every time you required funds for emergency clothing or food assistance, every time you hit bureaucratic walls that could only be solved with financial resources, that was me. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I thought back over the past 8 years, remembering dozens of times when mysterious donations had appeared just when we needed them most. Anonymous cashier's checks that allowed us to prevent evictions, gift cards that showed up when families needed groceries, scholarship funds that materialized for kids who needed educational support. The Riverside Emergency Fund that has been supporting your clients, that was me. The scholarship program that has sent 12 of your kids to college, that was me. The Housing Deposit Assistance Fund that has helped 37 families find stable homes, that was me, Emma. All of it. I was crying now, the tears making it difficult to read the careful handwriting. All those times I had felt like I was fighting the system alone, all those moments when I had wondered if my work was making any real difference. Grandma Rose had been there, quietly making sure I had the resources to continue. I funded your work not because I felt sorry for you, but because I believed in you. I watched you take those anonymous donations and use them with more wisdom and compassion than most people could manage with unlimited resources. You never wasted a penny. You never used the money for anything other than helping people who genuinely needed help. You proved over and over again that you could be trusted with resources that could change lives. Mr. Peterson handed me a box of tissues without comment, allowing me to compose myself enough to continue reading. So now, Emma, I am trusting you with something much larger. The Rose Chen Foundation has the resources to expand your work beyond anything you've imagined. You could fund similar programs in other cities, support other social workers who are fighting the same battles you've been fighting, create systematic change instead of just helping one family at a time. The letter was nearing its end, but each remaining paragraph felt like a gift I was afraid to unwrap. And the business ownership isn't about money, though there will be plenty of that. It's about influence. Chen Import employs over 300 people across 6 countries. The decisions that company makes affect communities, families, workers who are trying to build better lives for themselves. I want those decisions to be made by someone who understands that business success means nothing if it comes at the cost of human dignity. The final paragraph was the hardest to read, partly because of the tears in my eyes, and partly because of the weight of what it represented. Emma, you have spent your adult life proving that you don't need wealth or status to make a difference. Now I'm asking you to prove that you can have wealth and status without losing the qualities that make you extraordinary. Use these resources wisely, help people systematically, change systems, not just individual circumstances. And remember that the family who laughed at your $25 inheritance will now have to reckon with the fact that you control their financial futures. The letter was signed with a simple, "All my love and respect, Grandma Rose," followed by a small postscript, "P.S. Check the safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Box 847. Mr. Peterson has the key." I set the letter down carefully, as if it might evaporate if I moved too quickly. Mr. Peterson was watching me with patient kindness, clearly prepared to wait as long as I needed to process what I had just learned. "This is real," I said finally. It wasn't a question, but I needed to hear the confirmation. "It's completely real, Emma. Your grandmother spent 3 years planning every detail of this transfer. She wanted to make sure you would be supported through the transition, that you would have legal protection, and that you would understand the full scope of what she was entrusting to you. I thought about my family probably sitting in some expensive restaurant right now, discussing the business transitions and their new financial security. They had no idea that the woman they had just dismissed with barely concealed amusement was now in a position to make decisions that would directly affect their lives. But more than that, I thought about the kids I worked with, the families I tried to help within the constraints of limited resources and bureaucratic obstacles. I thought about other social workers in other cities facing the same challenges I faced every day. I thought about the systematic changes that could be made if someone with resources actually cared about making them. "Mr. Peterson," I said slowly, "what happens next?" Mr. Peterson reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small silver key attached to a simple keychain. "The safety deposit box is our next stop, but first I think you should understand the timeline your grandmother established. She didn't want you to be overwhelmed by everything at once." He opened another folder, this one containing what looked like a detailed schedule. "Rose created a transition plan that will roll out over the next 6 months. Today you learn about the foundation and the business ownership. Next week we'll meet with the foundation's board of directors, who have been operating under sealed instructions for the past year. The month after that, we'll begin the process of transferring the business shares and arranging your introduction to the management team." I stared at the timeline, trying to wrap my mind around the level of planning this represented. She thought of everything, didn't she? "Emma, your grandmother was one of the most meticulous people I've ever known. But more than that, she understood people. She knew that sudden wealth could be as destructive as sudden poverty if not handled carefully. She wanted to make sure you had time to adjust, to understand each piece of your new responsibilities before taking on the next." The drive to First National Bank felt surreal. I sat in the passenger seat of Mr. Peterson's Mercedes, watching Denver's downtown buildings slide past the window, trying to reconcile the ordinary Tuesday afternoon traffic with the extraordinary changes happening in my life. People were going about their normal routines, grabbing coffee, heading to meetings, completely unaware that the woman in the car beside them had just inherited control of a multi-million-dollar empire. The bank itself was imposing in the way that old financial institutions always are, all marble columns and brass fixtures designed to convey stability and trust. Peterson guided me through the process of accessing the safety deposit box, his familiarity with the procedures suggesting he had done this many times before. The box itself was larger than I had expected, roughly the size of a briefcase and heavier too. We carried it to a private viewing room, and Mr. Peterson handed me the key with something that looked like ceremony. "Your grandmother asked me to give you privacy for this part," he said. "Take as much time as you need. I'll be in the lobby when you're ready." Alone in the small windowless room, I lifted the lid of the box with hands that were still trembling slightly. The contents were organized with the same meticulous care that had characterized everything else about Grandma Rose's planning. On top was another letter, this one shorter than the first but written on the same expensive paper. Beneath it were stacks of documents, photographs, and what looked like jewelry boxes. But it was the letter that drew my attention first. "Emma, if you're reading this, then you've made it through the initial shock, and you're beginning to understand the scope of what I'm asking you to manage. I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed, though I suspect you probably are. Let me share with you why I have complete confidence in your ability to handle these responsibilities." The letter went on to detail specific examples of my work that she had somehow learned about in remarkable detail. She knew about the teenager I had helped get into community college after he had aged out of foster care. She knew about the family I had convinced to stay together through 6 months of intensive support instead of giving up and placing their children in the system. She knew about the advocacy work I had done to change policies at the state level, work that had mostly felt futile at the time. "You see, Emma, I haven't just been funding your emergency assistance program, I've been documenting your impact. I have files full of follow-up reports on the families you've helped, updates on the kids you've advocated for, data on the systematic changes you've influenced. You think you've been fighting small battles, but you've actually been winning a war against indifference, one family at a time." The next section of the letter made me sit back in my chair. "I know you're probably wondering about your family's reaction when they learn about this transfer of wealth and power. I want you to understand that their surprise will be genuine. I never told any of them about the foundation or the additional business assets. I wanted their treatment of you today to be completely authentic, uninfluenced by any knowledge of your eventual inheritance." She had orchestrated everything, I realized. The formal will reading, the family's reactions, my own humiliation, all of it had been carefully planned to create a moment of absolute clarity about who each person really was when they thought it didn't matter. "But Emma, I also want you to understand that your aunt, uncle, and cousins are not evil people. They are people who have been shaped by a system that values wealth and status above character and compassion. They have learned to measure worth in dollars and market share, not in lives touched or problems solved. This inheritance isn't about punishing them. It's about giving you the resources to show them a different way of measuring success." The letter continued with practical advice about managing family relationships, handling the inevitable requests for money and favors, and maintaining boundaries while still treating everyone with dignity. But it was the final section that hit me the hardest. "Emma, I need you to understand something important about this inheritance. It isn't just money and property and business ownership. It's also responsibility for continuing a legacy of service that your great-grandparents began when they first arrived in this country with nothing but hope and determination." She wrote about how my great-grandparents had built their first business not just to make money, but to create opportunities for other immigrants who were struggling to establish themselves. How they had quietly funded English classes, helped other families find housing, created informal networks of support that had helped dozens of people build new lives. Over the years, as the business grew and became more successful, we lost sight of that original mission. We became focused on profit margins and market expansion instead of community impact. The wealth I'm leaving you isn't just resources, Emma. It's an opportunity to return our family's legacy to its original purpose. Beneath the letter were photographs I had never seen before. Black and white images of my great-grandparents working in their first small shop, surrounded by other Chinese families who appeared to be customers and friends. Pictures of community gatherings, celebrations, children playing while adults worked together to build something larger than individual success. There were also more recent photographs, and these surprised me even more. Pictures of me at work, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Images of me talking with teenagers outside the youth center, helping a family load donations into their car, sitting in court during a custody hearing. The photographs spanned several years, and I realized that Grandma Rose had been documenting my work with the same care that family historians document weddings and graduations. The jewelry boxes contained pieces I recognized from family gatherings and holidays. Grandma Rose's jade bracelet, the one she wore every day for as long as I could remember. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had somehow managed to look elegant despite its plainness. But there were also pieces I had never seen before, including what appeared to be traditional Chinese jewelry that must have belonged to my great-grandmother. Each piece came with a small card explaining its history and significance. The jade bracelet had been a gift from my great-grandfather when they first opened their shop, bought with the profits from their first successful month in business. The wedding ring had been purchased when they saved enough money to afford matching bands, 5 years after their wedding. The traditional pieces had been brought from Taiwan, the only valuable possessions my great-grandmother had been able to carry when she left everything else behind. But it was the final box that contained the most surprising item. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small framed photograph that I had never seen before. It showed Grandma Rose as a young woman, probably in her 20s, standing beside a sign that read Chen Family Community Center. She was holding a ribbon and scissors, clearly about to cut the ribbon for some kind of opening ceremony. The card accompanying this photograph explained that in 1962, my grandparents had opened a community center in the neighborhood where they first lived when they arrived in America. The center had provided English classes, job placement assistance, temporary housing for new immigrants, and child care for families who were working multiple jobs to establish themselves. The center operated for 8 years, the card read, until urban renewal displaced the neighborhood and scattered the community we had been serving. Closing it was one of the greatest regrets of my life. I never stopped believing that we could have found a way to continue the work, to adapt to the changes instead of giving up. At the bottom of the safety deposit box was a final envelope, thicker than the others. Inside were architectural plans, property deeds, and what appeared to be construction contracts. The documents were recent, dated within the last 2 years, and they detailed the purchase and renovation of a building in East Denver, in a neighborhood that was currently home to a large population of recent immigrants and refugee families. A note clipped to the front of the documents explained everything. Emma, the Rose Chen Foundation's first major project is the reopening of the Chen Family Community Center, designed specifically to serve the kinds of families your great-grandparents once helped. The building has been purchased and the renovation is nearly complete. The center will offer the same services we provided 60 years ago, updated for the current needs of immigrant and refugee families. The plans showed a modern facility with classrooms for English instruction, computer labs for job training, child care facilities, a community kitchen, and temporary housing units for families in transition. There was also space designated for legal aid services, health screenings, and something called Family Advocacy Support. The Family Advocacy Support program is designed specifically around your expertise, Emma. It will provide the kind of comprehensive case management you've been doing for individual families, but with the resources to serve dozens of families simultaneously. You'll have a staff of social workers, legal advocates, and community liaisons, all working together to help families navigate the complex systems that determine their futures. I sat in that small bank room for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the documents, trying to understand the magnitude of what Grandma Rose had been planning. She hadn't just left me money. She had created a complete infrastructure for expanding the work I was already doing, scaling it up from individual cases to systematic change. But more than that, she had connected my work to our family's history in a way that made it feel like destiny rather than coincidence. The community center my great-grandparents had operated 60 years ago was being reborn through the foundation she had established in secret, using resources she had been accumulating for decades. When I finally emerged from the viewing room, Mr. Peterson was waiting in the lobby with coffee and what looked like infinite patience. He took one look at my face and smiled. "Overwhelming?" he asked. "That's one word for it," I replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Mr. Peterson, how long has she been planning this?" "I mean really planning all of it?" He considered the question carefully. "I think Rose began planning this the day she realized that your family didn't truly understand your value. But the specific details, the foundation, the community center, the business restructuring, those plans began about 5 years ago, when she started liquidating other investments to fund the foundation." 5 years, I repeated, trying to imagine Grandma Rose sitting in her comfortable Denver home, methodically planning a revolution that would turn our entire family dynamic upside down. "Emma, there's something else you should know," Mr. Peterson continued. "Your grandmother wasn't just planning for your financial security, she was planning for your protection. She knew that sudden wealth could make you a target for manipulation, not just from family members, but from people who would want to take advantage of your generosity." He pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be legal documents and contracts. "She established a team of advisors who will help you navigate the business decisions, investment choices, and foundation management. These are people she vetted carefully, people who share your values and understand your goals." "She thought of everything," I said, shaking my head in amazement. "Not everything," Mr. Peterson replied with a smile. "She left plenty of room for you to make your own choices, to shape the foundation and the community center according to your own vision. She gave you the framework, Emma, but the decisions about how to use it are entirely yours." As we drove back toward downtown Denver, I found myself looking at the city differently. The neighborhoods we passed through weren't just places where people lived and worked. They were communities full of families who might benefit from the kind of comprehensive support the new community center could provide. The office buildings weren't just corporate headquarters. They were places where policy decisions were made that could affect the lives of the people I worked with every day. "Mr. Peterson," I said as we pulled into his office parking garage, "when do I need to make decisions about all of this? I mean, when do I need to start actually doing something with these resources?" "The foundation board is expecting to meet with you next Tuesday," he replied. "But Emma, you've already been doing something with these resources for 8 years. You've been proving that you can use money wisely to help people in crisis. Now you just have a lot more money to work with. And my family, when will they find out about this?" Mr. Peterson's expression grew more serious. "That depends entirely on you. The foundation and the community center operate independently from the family business, so there's no legal requirement for them to know about those assets. But the business ownership will become public knowledge when we file the necessary paperwork with the state." "How long do I have before that happens?" "About 2 weeks. After that, it will be a matter of public record that you own controlling interest in Chen Import and Export." 2 weeks. 14 days to figure out how to handle a conversation that would change every family relationship I had ever known. 14 days to prepare for the moment when the cousins who had laughed at my $25 inheritance learned that I was now their boss. But as daunting as that conversation seemed, I found myself thinking more about the other implications of what I had learned. In 2 weeks, I would also be responsible for the livelihoods of over 300 employees across 6 countries. I would have the resources to expand the emergency assistance program that had been helping families for 8 years. I would have the opportunity to open a community center that could provide comprehensive support to immigrant and refugee families who were facing the same challenges my great-grandparents had faced decades ago. "Peterson," I said as we sat in his car, neither of us quite ready to end this extraordinary day, "do you think she was right? Do you think I can handle all of this without losing the things about myself that made her choose me in the first place?" He turned to look at me directly, his expression more serious than I had seen it all day. Emma, I've been watching wealthy families for 20 years. I've seen what money does to people who aren't prepared for it, and I've seen what happens when people with good intentions suddenly have unlimited resources. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Your grandmother wasn't just impressed by your work with individual families. She was impressed by your consistency. 8 years of having access to anonymous funding, and you never once used it inappropriately. 8 years of dealing with bureaucratic frustration and family dismissal, and you never became cynical or cruel. That's different from managing millions of dollars. Is it? He asked. Emma, the amount of money doesn't change the fundamental question. Will you use resources to help people, or will you use them to help yourself? You've been answering that question the same way for 8 years. I don't think a larger bank account is going to change your character. As I walked to my beat-up Honda Civic, parked between 2 luxury cars in the underground garage, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with my supervisor tomorrow. How do you explain to your boss that you might need to take some time off to manage the multi-million-dollar foundation you just inherited? How do you tell your coworkers that the emergency fund they've been relying on for years was actually funded by your grandmother? But more immediately, how do you drive home to your tiny apartment and eat leftover Chinese food while processing the fact that you now own enough resources to change thousands of lives? The strangest part of the drive home was how normal everything looked. The same traffic patterns, the same familiar landmarks, the same evening light falling across the mountains that surrounded the city. Nothing in the external world had changed, but everything in my internal world had been turned upside down. My phone started buzzing with text messages as I pulled into my apartment complex. Madison wanted to know what the additional matter had been about. Tyler was asking if there were any complications with the business transfers. Even Sophie had sent a message asking if I was okay and if I wanted to talk. I turned off my phone without responding to any of them. I needed time to process everything I had learned before I could even begin to figure out how to explain it to anyone else. Besides, in 2 weeks, the explanations would become unavoidable. For now, I just needed to sit with the magnitude of what had happened and try to understand what it meant for my future. My apartment felt different when I walked through the door. The same second-hand furniture, the same stack of case files on my kitchen table, the same photographs of kids I had worked with taped to my refrigerator. But now I saw it all through the lens of choice, rather than necessity. I lived here because I wanted to, not because I couldn't afford anything else. I did this work because it mattered to me, not because it was the only option available. That night, I spread all the documents from the safety deposit box across my kitchen table and read through them again, slowly this time, trying to absorb the practical details along with the emotional impact. The community center would be ready to open in 6 months. The foundation had enough resources to fund similar centers in 3 other cities if the pilot program was successful. The business ownership came with not just financial benefits, but also the responsibility to make decisions that would affect hundreds of employees and their families. As I sat surrounded by papers that represented more money than I had ever imagined having, I found myself thinking about the kids I worked with every day. Kids who aged out of foster care with no family support and no financial safety net. Kids who had learned not to expect much from adults, because adults had disappointed them so many times before. What would it mean to be able to help those kids not just navigate the existing system, but actually change the system itself? What would it mean to have the resources to create programs that addressed the root causes of family crisis instead of just responding to the symptoms? I picked up the framed photograph of Grandma Rose cutting the ribbon at the original community center. She looked so young in the picture, so hopeful and determined. I wondered if she had any idea, standing there with those scissors in her hand, that she was establishing a legacy that would still be making a difference 60 years later. The last thing I did before going to bed was to take the $25 check out of my purse and look at it again. 24 hours ago, it had represented the final confirmation of my place in the family hierarchy. Now it felt like something completely different. A reminder of who I had been when people thought I had nothing to offer, and a benchmark for measuring who I was becoming now that I had everything. I taped it to my bathroom mirror, right next to a photo of the teenagers from my current caseload. Tomorrow, I would still be the same person who showed up for court hearings and home visits and crisis interventions. But I would also be someone with the resources to make sure that other social workers in other cities had the support they needed to do the same work. As I fell asleep that night, I found myself thinking not about the money or the business ownership or even the family drama that was coming. I thought about the community center that was being built in East Denver, about the families who would find support there, about the possibility of creating systematic change instead of just responding to individual crises. Grandma Rose had been right about one thing. This wasn't about revenge against a family that had underestimated me. This was about having the resources to prove that the work I had chosen, the values I had prioritized, could make a difference on a scale I had never imagined possible. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Mr. Peterson had arranged for me to meet with the Foundation's board of directors on Tuesday, just as he had promised. What he hadn't prepared me for was discovering that the board consisted of 5 people whose work I had admired from a distance for years. Dr. Sarah Martinez ran the largest refugee resettlement program in Colorado. James Washington had built a network of transitional housing facilities that served over 2,000 families annually. Linda Kim managed educational support programs for immigrant children in 3 states. These weren't just competent administrators, they were people who had dedicated their careers to the same kind of systematic change I had only dreamed about creating. The meeting took place in a conference room that felt completely different from the sterile law office where I had learned about my inheritance. This space was warm and functional, with walls covered in photographs of families, children, and community gatherings. It felt like a place where real work got done, where decisions were made based on impact rather than profit margins. "Emma," Dr. Martinez said as we settled around the table, "Rose talked about you constantly. She was so proud of your advocacy work, your success rate with family preservation, your ability to navigate impossible bureaucratic situations, and still get results for the people who needed help. She showed us reports," James added, pulling out a thick folder that looked disturbingly familiar. "Detailed documentation of your cases over the past 8 years. Success stories, challenges you'd overcome, innovative approaches you'd developed when the standard procedures weren't working." I felt my face flushing. She was documenting my work. Linda smiled. "Emma, Rose wasn't just funding your emergency assistance program, she was building a case study. She wanted to understand exactly how you achieved the results you were getting, so we could replicate your methods in other locations." They spent the next 3 hours walking me through the Foundation's current projects and future plans. The community center in East Denver was just the beginning. There were similar facilities planned for Phoenix, Seattle, and Austin, all designed around the comprehensive case management model I had been developing without realizing it. "But we're not just talking about replicating your individual approach, Dr. Martinez explained. We're talking about creating a network of advocates who can share resources, strategies, and support. Social workers in Austin dealing with housing crises could connect with social workers in Denver who have solved similar problems. Case managers in Seattle working with refugee families could access legal resources from colleagues in Phoenix." The scope of what they were describing was overwhelming. I had spent years feeling like I was fighting the system alone, improvising solutions with limited resources and hoping for the best. Now they were talking about creating a coordinated network of professionals who could share knowledge and resources to help families systematically rather than individually. "There's something else," James said, pulling out another set of documents. Rose established partnerships with several universities. They're developing social work programs specifically focused on comprehensive family advocacy. Students would spend their internships working in the community centers, learning the approaches you've developed. She wanted to make sure this work could continue beyond any individual person, Linda added. She was thinking about sustainability, about creating institutional knowledge that wouldn't disappear if key people moved on to other jobs. By the time I left that meeting, my head was spinning with possibilities I had never imagined, but it was also spinning with the weight of responsibility. These weren't just programs that would help individual families. They were programs that could change how social work was done, how communities supported vulnerable populations, how systems could be rebuilt to actually serve the people they were supposed to help. The business side of my inheritance proved to be equally complex, but in completely different ways. Chen Import and Export operated on a scale that made my head hurt just thinking about it. Container ships moving goods across the Pacific, distribution networks that supplied retailers across the Midwest, relationships with manufacturers in 6 different countries. Madison and Tyler had been running day-to-day operations effectively for several years, but the strategic decisions where to expand, which partnerships to pursue, how to balance profit with ethical considerations, those decisions would now be mine to make. The transition meeting with the company's management team was scheduled for Friday, just 3 days before the ownership transfer would become public record. Mr. Peterson had arranged for it to take place at the company's headquarters, a gleaming office building in downtown Denver that I had driven past hundreds of times without ever imagining I would someday own it. Madison and Tyler were already in the conference room when I arrived, along with several other executives I didn't recognize. The atmosphere was professional but tense, with an undercurrent of curiosity and perhaps concern about what my involvement would mean for their operations. "Emma," Madison said, standing to greet me with a carefully controlled smile, "Mr. Peterson explained that Grandma left you some business interests. We're excited to work with you on the transition." I could see Tyler watching me carefully, probably trying to assess whether I had any idea what I was getting into. The other executives maintained polite expressions that revealed nothing about what they were thinking. Mr. Peterson took charge of the meeting with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout this entire process. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to inform you that effective Monday, Emma Chen will hold controlling interest in Chen Import and Export. She will be the majority shareholder and will have final authority over all strategic decisions." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to become uncomfortable. Madison's carefully controlled expression slipped slightly, revealing genuine shock. Tyler actually laughed, a short sound that he quickly tried to cover with a cough. "I'm sorry," Madison said, her voice tight with confusion. "Did you say controlling interest? As in, more than 50%? 67% to be precise," Mr. Peterson replied calmly. Tyler leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from amusement to something that looked like calculation. "Emma, no offense, but you don't know anything about import regulations, supply chain management, or international trade agreements. How exactly do you plan to make strategic decisions about a business you don't understand?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself for the past 2 weeks. But something in his tone, dismissive, almost condescending, reminded me of the laughter in the law office when I had received my $25 inheritance. "Tyler," I said, keeping my voice level, "you're right that I don't know about import regulations or supply chain management. But I do know about organizational mission, employee welfare, and community impact. I know about making decisions based on values rather than just profit margins." "Values don't pay salaries," Madison interjected, her diplomatic facade finally cracking. "Values don't keep contracts with international suppliers. This is a business, Emma, not a charity." "Actually," I replied, pulling out some of the documents Mr. Peterson had given me earlier that week, "this business has been operating as a partial charity for years. Did you know that Chen Import has been providing interest-free loans to small retailers who couldn't qualify for traditional financing? Did you know we've been paying above-market wages to our warehouse workers and providing health insurance that covers their entire families?" The expressions around the table suggested that no, they didn't know these things. Madison and Tyler exchanged glances that confirmed they had been operating with incomplete information about their own company's practices. Grandma Rose has been using this business to support community development for decades. I continued. The profits you've been so focused on maximizing, a significant portion of them have been going to programs that help the same kinds of families I work with every day. Mr. Peterson slid a folder across the table to Madison. These are the complete financial records for the past 5 years. I think you'll find that the company's community investment programs have actually strengthened our relationships with suppliers and improved our reputation with retail partners. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with Mr. Peterson walking everyone through the transition plan and the expectation for how business operations would continue. Madison and Tyler would retain their management roles and continue handling day-to-day operations. But decisions about company direction, major investments, and policy changes would require my approval. Emma, Tyler said as the meeting was winding down, I hope you understand that good intentions aren't enough to run a successful business. There are market pressures, competitive factors, regulatory requirements. Tyler interrupted. I understand that you're concerned about my qualifications. But let me ask you something. In the 5 years you've been managing operations, how many times have you visited our warehouse facilities? How many of our employees do you know by name? When was the last time you talked to the families who depend on the jobs we provide? He didn't answer, but his expression suggested he was beginning to understand that my approach to business ownership might be different from what he had expected. I'm not planning to micromanage operations or make decisions about things I don't understand. I continued. But I am planning to make sure that this company continues to reflect the values Grandma Rose built it on. We're going to be successful, but we're going to be successful in ways that support communities rather than exploiting them. The weekend before the ownership transfer became public was the last quiet time I would have for months. I spent Saturday at the construction site of the new community center, wearing a hard hat and safety glasses while the project manager walked me through the progress. The building was impressive even in its unfinished state. Large windows that would let in natural light, flexible spaces that could be reconfigured for different activities, a commercial kitchen designed to serve both the day-to-day meal programs and larger community events. But what struck me most was how welcoming the space felt, even with exposed beams and unfinished floors. Your grandmother had very specific ideas about how this space should feel, the project manager explained. She wanted it to be professional enough that people felt respected when they came here, but not so formal that they felt intimidated. Sunday, I drove to Grandma Rose's house for what I knew would be the last time I visited it as just her granddaughter rather than as the person responsible for continuing her legacy. Madison had inherited the house, but she had given me permission to spend some time there before she began the process of preparing it for sale. The house felt different without Grandma Rose in it, but her presence was still everywhere. The kitchen where she had made tea for every conversation we'd ever had. The back porch where she had told me I had the kind of courage my cousins didn't know existed. The study where she had apparently spent years planning the foundation and documenting my work. I found myself in that study, surrounded by filing cabinets and bookshelves, trying to understand how she had managed to coordinate so many complex projects without anyone in the family knowing what she was doing. The filing system was meticulous, with folders for every aspect of the foundation, the community center, the business modifications, and the transition plans. But there was also a folder labeled simply Emma, and when I opened it, I found 8 years of documentation that took my breath away. Copies of court reports I had written, newspaper articles about policy changes I had advocated for, letters from families I had helped, photographs of kids who had graduated from programs I had supported. She had been creating an archive of my work, building a comprehensive record of why she believed I was the right person to manage the resources she was leaving behind. But more than that, she had been documenting an approach to social work that she believed could be replicated and expanded. At the back of the folder was a handwritten note I had never seen before. Emma, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the extent to which I've been documenting your work. I hope you're not upset by the invasion of privacy. I needed to understand exactly how you achieved the results you were getting, because I wanted to make sure we could help other social workers achieve similar results. You have developed an approach to family advocacy that combines individual case management with systematic change. You help families navigate existing systems while also working to change those systems for future families. Most social workers do one or the other. You do both, and you do both effectively. The foundation, the community centers, the business ownership, all of it is designed to give you the resources to expand this approach. But more than that, it's designed to help you train other people to do this work. What you've figured out through years of experience, we can now teach systematically. Monday morning arrived with a flurry of phone calls that began before 7 a.m. and didn't stop until well past 10 p.m. The news about my business ownership had hit the local business press, and reporters wanted to know how a social worker had suddenly become the majority owner of one of Colorado's largest import companies. The first call came from Madison, her voice tight with stress and what sounded like genuine anger. "Emma, my phone has been ringing all morning. Business reporters, industry analysts, even some of our major clients. They all want to know what this ownership change means for company operations." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that operations would continue as normal, but Emma, I don't actually know if that's true." "Are you planning to make major changes? Are you going to bring in outside consultants? Are you going to start making decisions about contracts and supplier relationships?" I could hear the fear in her voice, and I realized that from her perspective, this transition represented a complete loss of control over her professional life. She had spent years building relationships and establishing credibility in an industry where she was already fighting to be taken seriously as a young woman. Now she was having to explain to clients and partners that her cousin, who had no business experience, was suddenly in charge of strategic decisions. "Madison," I said, "I'm not planning to make changes for the sake of making changes, but I am planning to make sure our business practices align with our values. If that requires modifications to how we operate, then yes, we'll make those modifications." "What does that even mean, Emma?" "Values don't negotiate contracts, values don't manage supply chains, values don't deal with currency fluctuations and shipping delays and regulatory compliance." "You're right," I replied, "but values do determine how we treat employees, how we select partners, how we respond to community needs, and how we measure success. Madison, this company has been operating according to Grandma Rosa's values for decades. I'm not changing the fundamental approach, I'm just making sure it continues." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Madison cycling through frustration, concern, and what eventually sounded like grudging acceptance that this transition was happening, whether she understood it or not. Tyler's call came that afternoon, and his approach was completely different. Instead of expressing concern about the business operations, he went straight to personal grievance. "Emma, I need to understand something. Did you know about this inheritance when we were sitting in that law office 2 weeks ago? Did you know that we were all being played while you sat there acting embarrassed about $25? The question was fair, but the accusation in his voice made me defensive. "Tyler, I had no idea about any of this until Mr. Peterson handed me that letter. I was just as shocked as everyone else." "But you're not shocked anymore. Are you? You're not questioning whether you deserve this, or whether you're qualified for it. You've just accepted that you're suddenly in charge of a business you know nothing about." "Tyler, I'm qualified to make decisions about organizational values and community impact. I'm qualified to ask questions about whether our business practices support or harm the communities we operate in. I'm qualified to insist that we treat employees and partners with respect and fairness. And you think Madison and I weren't doing those things?" The question caught me off guard, because I realized I didn't actually know what Madison and Tyler had been doing in their management roles. I had been so focused on learning about the foundation and the community center that I hadn't spent much time understanding how they had been running the business operations. Tyler, I don't think you were intentionally doing anything wrong, but I think you were operating without complete information about Grandma Rose's vision for this company. Now we all have that information, and we can make sure our operations reflect that vision. The media attention intensified throughout the week, with articles appearing in the Denver Business Journal, the Colorado Springs Gazette, and even a brief mention in a national trade publication. Most of the coverage was factual but puzzled, trying to understand how someone with no business background had suddenly acquired controlling interest in a successful import company. But it was the article in the Denver Post that changed everything. The reporter had done extensive research into my background, interviewing colleagues from the Department of Social Services, families I had worked with, and community leaders who knew about my advocacy work. The article wasn't just about the business inheritance, it was about the story behind the inheritance, about Grandma Rose's decision to entrust her legacy to someone who had dedicated their career to helping vulnerable families. It included quotes from teenagers I had helped navigate the foster care system, from parents who credited me with keeping their families together, from other social workers who described my approach to systematic change. Emma Chen has spent the past 8 years proving that individual advocacy and systematic change can work together, the article concluded. Now she has the resources to test whether those same principles can transform how businesses operate in their communities. The article changed the conversation completely. Instead of questions about my qualifications to run a business, reporters started asking about my plans for using business resources to support community development. Instead of skepticism about my lack of experience, there was curiosity about what new approaches I might bring to corporate responsibility. More importantly, the article brought attention to the Community Center project and the Foundation's broader mission. The phone started ringing with calls from other social workers who wanted to know about the programs we were developing, from community leaders who wanted to explore partnerships, from families who needed the services we were planning to provide. 3 months later, I stood in the main hall of the Chen Family Community Center, watching the controlled chaos of opening day. Families filled out intake forms while children played in the new childcare area. English language classes were beginning in one wing, while job training sessions started in another. The legal aid clinic had a waiting list that stretched through the week, but it was the family advocacy program that felt most like home to me. The same comprehensive case management I had been doing for individual families, but now with a team of advocates and access to resources that could address the systematic problems that created family crises in the first place. Maria Santos was one of our first clients, a single mother with 3 children who had been facing eviction when the landlord discovered that her husband, who had been deported 6 months earlier, was no longer contributing to the rent payments. In the old system, I might have been able to help her apply for emergency rental assistance, but the waiting list was months long, and the assistance was temporary. In the new system, we helped her enroll in the job training program, arranged childcare so she could attend classes, connected her with legal aid to address the immigration issues affecting her family, and provided temporary housing while she completed the program and found stable employment. 6 weeks later, she had a job with health insurance, her children were enrolled in after-school programs, and she was living in an apartment she could afford without assistance. "Emma," she said, during one of our follow-up meetings, "this place saved my family. But more than that, it gave me hope that I could actually build a future for my children." That conversation happened in my office at the community center, a space I had designed to feel comfortable rather than institutional. The walls were covered with photographs of families we had helped, children's artwork from the after-school programs, and thank you letters from people who had found stability through our services. But it was the framed $25 check that drew the most attention from visitors. I had moved it from my bathroom mirror to my office wall, where it served as a daily reminder of how much had changed, and how much had stayed the same. The check represented the moment when I had learned exactly what my family thought I was worth, but it also represented the moment when Grandma Rose's plan had begun to unfold, when the real measure of my value had started to become clear. 6 months after opening, the Denver Community Center was serving over 400 families. The success had attracted attention from foundations and government agencies interested in replicating the model in other cities. The centers in Phoenix and Seattle were scheduled to open within the year, and we had preliminary plans for facilities in Austin, Portland, and Minneapolis. But the business side of my inheritance had also evolved in ways I hadn't expected. Chen Import had expanded its community investment programs, partnering with small businesses owned by immigrant families, providing microloans for community development projects, and establishing supply chain relationships that supported fair labor practices internationally. Madison and Tyler had initially been skeptical of these changes, concerned that the community focus would hurt profitability, but the opposite had happened. Our reputation for ethical business practices had attracted new clients who wanted to work with companies that shared their values. Our employee retention had improved dramatically, reducing training costs and increasing productivity. Our relationships with suppliers had strengthened because they knew we were committed to long-term partnerships rather than just short-term cost savings. Emma, Madison said during one of our quarterly review meetings, "I have to admit, I was wrong about this whole approach. I thought focusing on values would mean sacrificing success, but we're more successful now than we've ever been." Tyler nodded in agreement. The clients want to work with us specifically because of our community involvement. They see it as evidence that we're reliable partners who think about long-term relationships rather than just individual transactions. The family dynamics had changed too, in ways that were both predictable and surprising. Madison and Tyler had both apologized for their reactions during the will reading, acknowledging that they had been cruel and dismissive. Sophie had become one of my closest advisors, helping to design programs that served college-age immigrants who were navigating higher education systems. Even Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert had begun to understand that this inheritance hadn't been about punishing them for their treatment of me. It had been about giving me the resources to prove that the approach to life I had chosen could work on a larger scale. "Emma," Aunt Patricia said during a family dinner 6 months after the will reading, "I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've built with the community center." Rose would be proud too. Uncle Robert raised his wineglass in what appeared to be a genuine toast to Emma, who showed us that there are different ways to measure success, and that sometimes the best business decisions are the ones that help other people succeed too. But it was the letter I found in Grandma Rose's desk that affected me most deeply. I had discovered it during the final cleanup of her house, tucked inside a book she had been reading before she died. The letter was addressed to me, but it was different from the others, more personal, less formal. "Emma, if you're reading this, then you've probably spent the past few months wondering whether I made the right choice in leaving you with all these responsibilities. Let me assure you that I have no doubts whatsoever. I didn't choose you because you were the most obvious candidate or because you were the most prepared for wealth and power. I chose you because you were the only one who had proven that you could hold power without being corrupted by it, because you had demonstrated that you could have resources without losing your compassion. But more than that, I chose you because you were the only one who understood that our family's real legacy isn't the money we accumulated or the business we built. Our real legacy is the way we chose to use our resources to support people who needed support. Your great-grandparents understood this when they first arrived in America. They built the first community center, not because it was profitable, but because it was necessary. I lost sight of this understanding for many years, focusing on business growth instead of community impact. You helped me remember what really mattered. Emma, the resources I've left you aren't just tools for helping individual families. They're tools for changing how social work is done, how businesses operate in their communities, how wealth can be used to create systematic change rather than just individual comfort. I know you'll use these resources wisely because you've been proving that you can use resources wisely for 8 years. I know you'll stay connected to the work that matters to you because that work has always been more important to you than personal recognition or financial security. But most importantly, I know you'll remember that the point of having resources isn't to have resources. The point is to use them to make sure that other people have the opportunities and support they need to build meaningful lives. The letter was signed with infinite love and respect, Grandma Rose, followed by a postscript that made me smile through my tears. P.S. Keep that $25 check somewhere you can see it. not as a reminder of how your family once treated you, but as a reminder of how far you've come and how much further you can go. A year after the will reading, I returned to Mr. Peterson's office for our annual review of the Foundation's operations and the business performance. The conference room looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed completely. The Foundation was now operating community centers in 5 cities, supporting over 2,000 families annually. The advocacy training program had graduated its first class of comprehensive case managers who were implementing similar approaches in social service agencies across the region. The business had expanded its community investment programs and was being recognized as a model for corporate social responsibility. "Emma," Mr. Peterson said, as we reviewed the annual reports, "your grandmother would be amazed by what you've accomplished, but I don't think she would be surprised." "I still feel like I'm learning as I go," I admitted. "There are days when I wonder if I'm making the right decisions, if I'm using these resources the way she intended." "Emma, Rose didn't leave you detailed instructions because she didn't want you to simply follow a plan she had created. She wanted you to build on the foundation she had established, to develop new approaches, to solve problems she couldn't have anticipated." He pulled out a final envelope, one I had never seen before. "She asked me to give you this on the first anniversary of the will reading. She said it was the last piece of guidance she could offer." The letter inside was brief, just a single page, but it contained the message I needed to hear. "Emma, by the time you read this, you'll have spent a year learning to manage resources you never expected to have. You'll have made decisions that affected hundreds of people's lives. You'll have faced challenges that tested your values and your judgment. I hope you've also learned that you were ready for these responsibilities all along. The work you did with individual families prepared you for the work you're now doing with communities. The decisions you made with limited resources prepared you for the decisions you're now making with unlimited resources. Most importantly, I hope you've learned that
wealth and power are tools, not goals. The goal is still the same as it always was: to help people build stable, meaningful lives in communities that support their success." Emma, you are living proof that character matters more than credentials, that values matter more than experience, that choosing to serve others is the most powerful thing any person can do. Thank you for proving that I chose the right person to continue this work. Thank you for showing our family what real success looks like. Thank you for using these resources to make the world a better place. And thank you for keeping that $25 check as a reminder that other people's opinions of your worth have nothing to do with your actual value." That evening, I stood in my office at the community center, looking at the wall of photographs that documented the families we had helped, the programs we had created, the systematic changes we had influenced. The $25 check was still there, framed and prominent, but now it was surrounded by evidence of what had been built from that moment of humiliation. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sophie, who was now managing the college support program. "Emma, we just got approval for the scholarship expansion. 20 more students will be able to start college this fall. Grandma Rose would be so proud." She was right. Grandma Rose would be proud, not because I had proven my worth to a family that had once dismissed me, but because I had used the resources she had entrusted to me to create opportunities for other people to prove their own worth. The real inheritance hadn't been the money or the business ownership or even the foundation. The real inheritance had been the understanding that resources are only valuable when they're used to create more resources for other people. That power only matters when it's used to empower others. That success is only meaningful when it creates opportunities for other people to succeed. As I turned off the lights and locked the community center for the night, I thought about the families who would be coming through those doors tomorrow, looking for help navigating systems that seemed designed to keep them from succeeding. They would find more than assistance with individual problems. They would find advocates who understood that individual problems often had systematic solutions, that changing lives sometimes required changing systems, that the most important work happened when people with resources chose to share those resources with people who needed them. Grandma Rose had been right about everything. The $25 had been a test, but not the test I had thought it was. It hadn't been a test of my worthiness for her love or respect, It had been a test of my character when faced with dismissal and disappointment. A test of whether I would become bitter or remain committed to the work that mattered to me. I had passed that test without even knowing I was taking it. And in passing it, I had proven that I was ready for the real inheritance, the opportunity to change how resources are shared, how communities support their most vulnerable members, how business success can be measured by community impact rather than just profit margins. The $25 check would stay on my wall, not as a reminder of shame, but as a symbol of transformation. A reminder that the most important changes often begin with moments that feel like endings, that the most powerful inheritances aren't the ones that give you what you want, but the ones that give you what you need to help other people get what they need. 2 years had passed since that afternoon in Mr. Peterson's conference room, and the transformation that had begun with a $25 check had rippled outward in ways I was still discovering. The morning sun was filtering through the windows of what had become my office at the Foundation headquarters, a renovated warehouse space in downtown Denver that somehow managed to feel both professional and welcoming. I was preparing for what had become one of my favorite parts of the job, the quarterly meeting with our network of social workers from across 5 states. These weren't administrative meetings focused on budget reports and compliance metrics, though we covered those topics too. These were gatherings where frontline advocates shared strategies, celebrated victories, and helped each other navigate the impossible situations that came with trying to help families in crisis. Jenny Morrison from the Seattle Center was video conferencing in early, her face appearing on my screen with the kind of exhausted enthusiasm that told me she had been working too many late nights again. "Emma, you need to hear about the family we placed last week. Single father with 4 kids, all under 10, evicted from their apartment because the landlord found out about his criminal record from 15 years ago." I settled into my chair, giving her my complete attention. This was why I loved these meetings. Every story represented a family that might have fallen through the cracks in the old system, but was finding stability in the new one we had built together. In the old days, I would have spent weeks trying to find emergency housing, probably ending up splitting the family between multiple temporary placements, Jenny continued. But with the housing partnership we established through the foundation, we had him and all 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment within 48 hours. 6 months later, he's completed the job training program, found stable employment, and the kids are thriving in the after-school programs. Maria Chen, no relation to my family despite sharing the surname, was running the Phoenix Center and had logged in from her car during her morning commute. We had something similar last month. Refugee family from Syria, 6 people living in a studio apartment, father working 3 part-time jobs just to cover rent. 5 years had transformed everything, yet somehow the essence remained unchanged. I was still showing up for families in crisis, still fighting systems that seemed designed to fail the people who needed them most. The difference was scale and the tools at my disposal. The Foundation's annual conference was being held in Chicago this year, bringing together over 300 social workers, case managers, legal advocates, and community organizers from 12 states. The hotel conference center buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from people who have found others who understand their work. A young woman approached me tentatively, her conference badge identifying her as Sarah Gonzalez from the San Antonio Department of Family Services. She couldn't have been more than 25, with the kind of determined expression I recognized from my own early days in social work. "Emma Chen, I had to tell you that your approach to comprehensive case management changed my entire career trajectory. I was about to quit social work entirely when I attended one of your training workshops last year." Sarah's story was painfully familiar. She had entered social work with idealistic determination, only to encounter bureaucratic obstacles, inadequate resources, and a system that seemed more focused on processing paperwork than actually solving problems. She had been carrying a caseload of 47 families with nothing but referrals to waiting lists and oversubscribed programs. "You talked about treating individual advocacy and systematic change as complementary parts of the same work. about building partnerships with housing providers, employers, and other community resources, so you weren't just making referrals but actually creating pathways to stability. She pulled out a worn notebook covered in sticky notes. I started implementing your documentation framework. Within 3 months, I had enough data to convince my supervisor to let me pilot a partnership with local landlords willing to work with families who had rental history problems. That pilot program has now placed 23 families in stable housing. 23 families who would have been cycling through shelters are now in apartments they can afford. And my supervisor is asking me to develop similar partnerships with employers and healthcare providers. This was exactly what the foundation had been built to enable. Not just individual advocates finding isolated solutions, but a framework that allowed effective approaches to be replicated and scaled. The afternoon breakout sessions captured the spirit of what we had created. Sarah presented her landlord partnership model to a standing room-only crowd. By the end of her session, 17 advocates from 8 different cities had exchanged contact information to collaborate on adapting her model for their communities. But it was Madison's presentation that drew the biggest crowd. She was discussing how businesses could integrate community support into their core operations, rather than treating it as separate charitable activity. When Emma inherited controlling interest in our family business, my initial reaction was concern that community values would compromise business success. Madison began. I spent my entire career learning that profit maximization was the primary measure of business effectiveness. She clicked to the next slide, showing 5 years of financial performance data. As it turns out, I was completely wrong. Since implementing values-based business practices, Chen Import has seen increases in revenue, employee retention, and client satisfaction. We're more profitable now than we were before, not despite our community focus but because of it. After her presentation, Madison found me on the hotel terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. The city lights reflected off the water, creating a shimmering pathway that seemed to stretch toward infinite possibilities. Emma, I need to tell you something I've been thinking about for months. I want to start a separate foundation focused specifically on helping businesses integrate community values into their operations. You're helping families directly through social services. I want to help businesses create the kind of employment and economic opportunity that prevents families from needing crisis intervention in the first place. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity and potential impact. Madison, that's exactly the kind of systematic thinking that Grandma Rose was hoping would emerge from this work. Uncle Robert has already agreed to be the primary funder for the first 3 years. He said watching you and me transform over the past 5 years has made him reconsider what he wants to do with the wealth he's accumulated. The next morning, I gave the closing keynote address. As I stood backstage, I thought about Sarah and her landlord partnership program, about Madison's evolution from profit-focused executive to values-driven business leader, about the 300 advocates who were learning to see their work as part of a larger movement. 5 years ago, I inherited resources I never expected to have, but more importantly, I inherited a question: what will you do with what they laughed at? I told them about the will reading, about the $25 check, about my family's laughter. But I also told them about what came after the discovery of Grandma Rose's plan, the foundation that had been waiting for me, the community centers designed to systematically address barriers that created family crises. I pulled the framed check out of my bag and held it up. I carry this with me to every major foundation event, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a reminder of transformation. This check represents the moment when everything changed, when I learned that my worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. That evening, I returned to Denver exhausted but energized. My apartment had changed very little despite my changed circumstances. I had chosen to stay in the same modest space, a deliberate choice to remember where I had come from, and why the work mattered. There was a package waiting at my door, forwarded from the foundation's office. Inside was a letter and a photograph, showing a young woman in a graduation cap and gown. The letter explained that this was Jasmine Rodriguez, one of the first teenagers I had worked with 8 years earlier. Emma, I don't know if you remember me, but you changed my entire life trajectory. When I was 15 and living in that group home, you were the first adult who treated me like my opinions and feelings actually mattered. She wrote about how I had helped her get into therapy, advocated for her education, supported her through aging out of foster care. I just graduated from SUNY Albany with a degree in social work, Emma. I'm starting my MSW program in the fall because I want to do for other kids what you did for me. The letter concluded with a request that made my throat tight. If you ever need social workers who understand what it's like to be on the other side of the system, I hope you'll consider me. I want to be part of what you're building. I responded immediately, arranging for Jasmine to intern at the Denver Community Center during the summer before starting her graduate program. 6 months later, I was back in Mr. Peterson's office for our annual review. But today he had something different on his agenda. He pulled out a folder that looked old and worn. Emma, when Rose first came to me about establishing the foundation, she gave me sealed instructions to be opened at specific intervals. This is the last one, to be opened 5 years after the will reading. I took the envelope home and waited until evening before opening it. The letter inside was the longest yet, written in sections over several months. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then 5 years have passed since the will reading, and I hope you've begun to understand not just what I was trying to give you, but why I chose such an elaborate method. She wrote about watching me throughout my 20s, seeing me choose social work despite family pressure, seeing me stay committed despite low pay and limited recognition, seeing me develop approaches to comprehensive advocacy. What impressed me most wasn't your dedication or skills or results, though all were remarkable. What impressed me was your character when faced with obstacles. You never became bitter when families couldn't overcome their circumstances. You never became cynical when bureaucratic systems blocked solutions. You never stopped believing that individual people mattered. The letter addressed family dynamics, her regret that she hadn't challenged unhealthy values earlier. The will reading was designed to show you, with absolute clarity, who your family members were when they thought you had nothing to offer. But more importantly, I needed to show them who you were when faced with dismissal. Would you become vindictive? Would you become bitter? Would you change your values now that you had resources? Those were the questions I needed answered, not because I doubted you, but because they needed to see the answers. The next section addressed something I had been thinking about as the foundation grew. Emma, 5 years is long enough to establish that the foundation's approach is effective. Now it's time to begin planning for the next phase, ensuring that this work continues beyond your direct involvement. She had specific suggestions for governance structures, financial sustainability, leadership development. You've proven that comprehensive advocacy works. Now you need to prove that these approaches can outlive their founders, that they can become institutional rather than personal. The letter concluded with one final revelation. Emma, there's one more thing I need to tell you. When I was your age, I received a similar inheritance from my own grandmother, the one who gave me $25 as a dismissive gesture when I chose to marry your grandfather. My grandmother died 3 years later, and her will revealed she had been watching me carefully. She left me the equivalent of what would now be about $3 million, along with a letter explaining that she wanted to see if I would give up on my choices when faced with family rejection, or if I would stay true to my values. That inheritance became the seed money for everything our family built, but more importantly, it taught me that resources matter less than character, that other people's opinions of your worth have nothing to do with your actual value. Emma, you are continuing something that started with my grandmother's test. The $25 check you received wasn't just my test for you, it was my way of passing on a tradition of testing character, of ensuring resources are entrusted to people who will use them wisely. Keep that check, Emma. Let it remind you that every ending is also a beginning, that every dismissal can become an opportunity for transformation. And when the time comes, find someone else whose character has been tested by rejection. Someone who has stayed true to their values despite the cost. Pass the test forward, Emma. Let this tradition continue.
I sat there as the sun set, holding this final letter, and understanding the full scope of what she had given me. It wasn't just the foundation or the business, or the financial resources. It was membership in a lineage of women who had used unexpected inheritances to create opportunities for others, who had transformed dismissal into determination, who had built legacies that multiplied through the people they touched. I thought about Jasmine Rodriguez, who would be starting her graduate program in the fall. I thought about Sarah Gonzalez, and her landlord partnership program being replicated in 8 cities. I thought about Madison's plans for a business foundation that would help companies integrate community values. The work was multiplying exactly as Grandma Rose had hoped, spreading through advocates who learned new approaches, through family members who transformed their understanding of success, through families who received support and became resources for others. 5 years after that humiliating afternoon in Mr. Peterson's conference room, I finally understood what Grandma Rose had been trying to teach our entire family. Worth isn't determined by wealth or status or other people's opinions. Worth is determined by what you do with whatever resources you have, by whether you use them to build barriers or bridges. The $25 check had become exactly what she intended, not a reminder of shame but a symbol of transformation. A marker of the moment when everything changed, when tests became opportunities, when one woman's elaborate plan created ripples that would continue spreading long after all of us were gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just